Excellent.
Let me know when you want me to call the meeting to order.
Ready?
Call meeting to order. And we will begin with the roll call.
Andrea Wheeler,
Here.
David Burkhart,
Here.
Jeff Micco,
Here.
Okay, then we have our public comment period. This portion of the meeting is reserved for persons desiring to address the committee on any matter not on the agenda. Are there any members of the public who would like to speak?
members calling in can raise their hand by pressing *9. Then I can call on you. There are none.
Thank you.
Excuse me, do we know if problems on the line?
There is someone on the line, but I'm not sure who it is.
Can you hear us?
Maybe. Usman's iPhone, if you can hear us.
Raise your hand if you are Rothman.
Oh, does that sound like Lisa? Okay.
Then we'll move to the approval of the January 11th minutes. Anyone want to make a motion to approve?
I'll make motion to approve minutes. Second it.
Any questions, comments, or corrections on the minutes? Hearing none. Vote.
Andrea Wheeler,
Yes.
David Burkhart,
Yes.
Jeff Micco,
Yes.
The minutes are approved. And we have an opening report. This was meant to be the introduction of our new members, Rob Latora and Linda Marquez, but unfortunately neither of them could make it this week, this meeting, so we will meet with them next month. On to new business. So this is the portion where we are going to review the selected transactions. We'll do them one at a time. And for the members of the committee who reviewed the transaction, there's an opportunity for you to ask any questions, either about the project or about documentation. Keep in mind, this is also a time if you want to make a recommendation of something we want to recommend for next time. If based on your review, you found something you'd like to do differently next time, this is a time to bring it up, note, and that will go into our final report. After we review the transactions, we'll review if there are any other recommendations that anyone wants to make in the report. And we will also review the recommendations we made last year to see where we are, because in this year's report, we report on the status of the recommendations last year. So there's kind of three portions to this one agenda item. Does that make sense? So obviously, we're done with the transactions, no staff. So shall we start with transaction number 1?
Sure, this was, so I go ahead and.
I think that Stina gets a big overview to start.
Yes.
I'm waiting for the music.
Good evening, committee members. Justina Teen, Fiscal Services Officer. Since the last time we met, we've distributed the selected transactions, had the reviewers review it. And so as Chair had mentioned, we'll be discussing the review. The process today will go in order through the transactions. And I will also be screen sharing the cover sheet so that the rest of the committee can follow along as to what the reviewer had submitted. And we would mainly focus on whether the transaction was within the time frame of the fiscal year, whether the scope of work as well as the expenses conform to the either Measure Q or Measure T expenditure plan. And for any type of land, for large purchases like land acquisitions or the grant disbursement that you had seen the board resolution that was approved by the board. And project managers or the department managers are available to answer questions. And so with that, we'll kind of go over each one. I'll start with transaction number 1. Let me just move over to that screen. Trying to see why it's a little truncated. Yeah, this one. Yeah, looks better. Okay, transaction number 1. This one here was related to the purchase of Tilton Ranch compound. We had a contribution of 1.2 million from one of our partners. We had made a deposit of 100,000 earlier in the year. And so the remaining costs to close escrow was just a little under 3.7 million. And so when we budgeted for this purchase, we had about 3.3 million available in Measure Q funds. And so we had to augment with Measure T funds in the amount of 346,000. And that's why in the PO, you'll see that split of the total costs in the escrow statement. And for the specific selection that the committee had picked, the committee happened to have selected the second line of the PO, which is what you ended, the reviewer ended up reviewing. And so kind of going through it, as I was reviewing the cover sheet, it appears that there wasn't any issues or that everything conformed with the plan. But I'll turn it over to Jeff if you have any comments or questions regarding this transaction.
I agree, and I thought your clarifications were very helpful.
Oh,
Pretty straightforward transaction.
Oh.
My comment.
Awesome.
How can I do it?
Oh, press the is button. Yeah, there you go.
So I thought your clarifications were very helpful. Just again, it was a pretty straightforward transaction, and it met all of our criteria. I had no additional comments.
Oh, thank you. So then moving on to transaction number 2. Okay. And so this transaction was for the purchase of the Ocean Queen property. The total wire matched the final amounts to close escrow, but staff had itemized the total transaction costs into 3 items, and the selected transaction happened to be the second line item in the PO. And I think there were some comments regarding the documentation, and I could address those first. And then any questions regarding the acquisition of the property itself, I can also defer to the project manager, excuse me. So then let me kind of scroll down just so that everyone can kind of see the additional comments. And so this one here is a little bit of terminology, missing invoice. In acquisitions, sometimes we use settlement statement, sometimes the escrow statement, buyer statement. But that is the documentation we would use to process this transaction. And it usually comes from the title company that tells us how much it is to close escrow. And then in terms of the vendor not listed on the transaction list, that one is because we actually did a journal entry because we had originally coded it to the incorrect fund with Measure T, and then we moved it back to Measure Q because that was actually where it was intended to be budgeted from. And so when we did the journal entry, the system itself doesn't carry over the vendor information. And then again, for the number 15, the settlement statement, again, it's terminology. Sometimes the title company uses different terms but then in terms of the improvements fee, I would defer over to Linda Kwong, our real property program manager.
Thank you, Justina. So as far as Linda Kwong, real property program manager, and in terms of the invoice not breaking out the improvements fee was negotiated as part of the purchase and sale agreement. And so the agreement itself outlines 2 things. One, the purchase of the property, the land, and that was 1,045,000. And then these improvement fees for reimbursing the seller of the entitlements that were sought at the time for the development. Those were spelled out in the purchase and sale agreement, but when it came to escrow submitting the settlement statement, it's just the whole amount that was being submitted into escrow.
So, yeah, I guess I was confused why the escrow statement wouldn't break it out. Is that just because you're just seeing the total going into escrow?
That's correct.
And so the other thing and this was my question for number 14. I do understand that like the closed session doesn't usually include like the actual like negotiation numbers that want to keep that private. But there's no indication that part of this purchase included this plan to build a home, but it seems like, if I understand it correctly, the seller had to cover some costs in order to make it work. Is that why it's part of the escrow settlement?
So this is a particularly unique case in some ways because this was a proposal for a home next to our Bay Valley Open Space Reserve on 10 acres. And they had gone through the permitting process and gotten to the point where they had completed the environmental analysis, and we were appealing that. And so there was some sensitivity there between the appeal of the environmental analysis that they said was any mitigated negative declaration, which means basically no impacts, so that any impact would be mitigated. And working through this negotiation to try to get a sale to occur. And so we had engaged with special counsel, engaged with their counsel to work out what we were buying from them, which included paying for the property, but also reimbursing these fees, which we did receive supporting documentation from the seller, itemizing each of the things that we're reimbursing. Originally, they had sought a higher number, but we went through and checked and looked for cancel checks to make sure that everything that they paid for was actually in line with what we were willing to reimburse. And so that's how we arrived at this number, which was approved by the board as part of the purchasing sale agreement.
So is this a house like we don't currently build, or was part of the purchase agreement to convince them not to build the house?
The latter. So we acquired it and now it's under our protection. I'm happy to say, it's under our stewardship and management. They had gone as far as getting, entitlements and permitting, but they didn't break ground.
I guess the only thing with this is that I think it's it was like partly broken out of the purchase amount and partly not, and so just created a little confusion because it made it seem like it was well, we agreed to buy this property for this much money, but then we also then ended up spending maybe more money than we thought because it's not clear from the paperwork. And again, I understand that it's clear from the board resolution, but it just raises a little bit of red flags of it not being clear how it decided. Being the skeptic, I would say, it seems like somewhere along the way they decided to spend more money than was originally approved by the board in order to take care of this. Nothing wrong with this plan, just it didn't seem like it, it wasn't super clear. I'm not sure if I have any recommendation based on that because it seems like it's a unique situation. But just to just to raise the fact that it raises a little red flag from the perspective.
Thank you. And then moving on to transaction number 3. So transaction number 3 was for a progress billing of a fence installation at Diablo Foothills Open Space Preserve, which was actually one of the site of damage. I apologize, due to the cruise fire in 2020. And then kind of scrolling down, I've seen a lot of the yes boxes checked, and namely that it the amount that the expense itself conforms to the expenditure plans and eligible for funding. And then there was one comment which I can address in terms of the PO, including 2 projects. When the fire first broke out, usually in emergencies, we immediately create a new project ID so that, and the first one was the P285 in the PO. That was the cruise fire emergency response project ID that we started coding for staff to spend time assessing any damage, mitigating any public safety concerns. And then after the assessment, so what happened was the very first transaction against that project number was putting a deposit into the fence supplies for the vendor. But what happened was at the beginning of the fiscal year, as we knew that the project was going to become a construction project, capital improvement, we spun that out so that we could start tracking that project on its own and away from the emergency response part of the project. And that ended up being P320. So it was kind of a not quite a parent-child one, but more of it was born out of the 285 response.
I'm curious, and I know you told me this before and I've forgotten, what does MQ and MQ?
MQ is our coding in the system that informs accounting that it's coming out from Measure Q funds.
Okay,
And then MT would be from Measure T funds.
yeah. I'm like construction. So,
Oh, I get it.
yeah. It's one of the easier. So I'm just going back to the PO again. I messed up all my PO. So the PO that shows. So there was a different invoice again. P285.
Yes.
Okay, then that clarifies my question. Great, thank you.
Mhm. Okay, let's scrolling down to transaction number 4. And so this transaction was for engineering services for the pond restoration out at Blair Ranch at Rancho Cañada del Oro Open Space Preserve. We had a contract with Sherwood Design Engineers to provide engineering services for the pond restoration. We issued 3 task orders against that contract. And this specific work on this invoice was related to the 95% design plans that they had billed us for. Again, the amount that they billed is not for the entire project. It's just more of a progress billing as under that contract. And then I think in general, I saw that the review had mentioned that the expense was eligible for Measure Q, Measure T funding and conforms to the plan. There was additional comment about competitive bidding. And I was wondering if, Jeff, do you have any comments regarding that I can help answer?
No, it's just nice to see that.
Oh.
To get an insight into the bidding process for this, for awarding this contract.
Got it. Okay.
Give some background about how.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and I'm glad to hear that the board report documentation helps, that you're able to see that we received 5 bids against that and awarded
Right.
that contract.
What are your clarifications once again, because the vendor was purchased by another company and.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was the only comment.
Oh, thank you. Okay. So in that case, moving down to transaction number 5. I'm just gonna scroll down a little bit. And this transaction is related to a health and safety. This transaction is a health and safety related expense that we incur at all our preserves as part of everyday operations and maintenance. For this specific invoice, we had procured 8 AED defibrillators, and based on where they were assigned to, we charged it to the appropriate preserve ID. And then again, the selection was just a specific line item in the PO. And so the PO itself, as I scrolled down, there were some comments regarding how the PO was applied to not only P90, but also P88. But again, it was because we purchased the 8, but we had reassigned them to different locations.
So I was supposed to do the 88.
Correct.
And the 88. It sounds like what you did is you said we need this many, and then later you decided, well, we need a certain amount, 6 at one location and 2 at another location. Is that how that works?
Yeah, we basically assign the costs to the appropriate location. So
Okay,
almost like a cost center.
okay, then that makes sense.
Okay. So scrolling down to transaction number 6.
Wasn't worth the wait, was it? Go ahead and implement it. Just so you know, this committee has been doing this for years. We've got several people. This used to be quite a long drawn out process with like half an hour questions sometimes on projects, but everyone's worked so great to get the documentation so good. It's going much better. That's honestly good.
Right, plus we're hungry and we wanna. Thank her, right? Thank you.
So transaction number 6, this transaction was for consulting to staff about the early detection rapid response, which I believe, and Aaron can correct me, but I believe it's a method to treat invasive plants. And I think, again, reviewer had mentioned, looks good on the cover sheet. No comments, but I was wondering if you had any questions or if you want to know more about what this expense was about.
No, it's informative, but no questions on the financial.
Thank you. Okay, so then moving on to transaction number 7. Heading into the grant disbursement territory. So this was actually the first and the last final. They actually did it all in one go and closed out the project. But it was a disbursement to grant number 23, which was to the city of Santa Clara. And it was for the Bowers Park Habitat Restoration and Pathway Installation Project. I think as I scroll down again, there were some good reviews. Everything looked in order, but there were additional comments, and I was wondering if the reviewer had any questions or comments to add to the to further elaborate.
Sure. There's a lot of receipts, documenting expenditures and whatnot that they're meant to see, but some of the expenditures involve, tools that you didn't really see identified in the scope, and it's something that, in my opinion, can get out of hand pretty sometimes on projects where people have liberty to, acquire tools that are not going to stay part of the project necessarily. They're going to maybe go someplace else after the project's done. So that's kind of just wondering if there are controls, in that regard. It's nice to buy a touch grill or piece of power tools and stuff like that. Where do those go? It wasn't explicit in the scope that there would be acquisition of personal tools or power tools. So that was my point.
Yeah, that's good feedback. I'm Matt Freeman, I'm Assistant General Manager. It's good to see you again. Nice to meet other committee members. Yeah, I haven't looked specifically at the receipts myself, but my understanding is the city requested a budget change so they could cover supplies for the project, including lumber. It was a construction project, and so we evaluated, right, that lumber was kind of in keeping with the goal to create that decomposed granite pack and to assist in some of the habitat restoration efforts. The intent would absolutely not be to enable, any contractors, right, to walk away with tools that could be used on other projects. But again, I think our understanding was that this was material primarily for that's going to be what the project itself.
But I think there's actually receipt for tools. I can see it myself, right?
The receipts are there. There's transparency with respect to what was purchased. It's just that it could get out of hand. I think, somebody goes to a hardware store and they're, wow, we need a better power saw. I know after the project I can take it home. And or stuff like that. I've seen it,
Well, in particular because these tools were purchased by the grantee.
City.
Yeah.
So then they retained the tool. Is the thought that they'll retain the tools for maintenance or?
Yeah, if it's beyond lumber, I think the intent or the expectation would be that they're contributing to the maintenance and the upkeep of the improvement, the grant funding paid for.
I think I agree with that, though. It seems like there should be some type of approval process for. What's the term I'm looking for, like?
Inventory control.
Well, things that are, you know, it's not labor, it's not materials that are needed for the project, it's an asset that's been purchased. We think we asset.
This is a red flag for me because of my experience.
In our tool set.
I have tons, yeah, I have. No, but we had really significant problems with respect to that kind of thing.
Is there a procedure or policy for that kind of expenditure on the grant?
Yeah, that we review each request from a grantee, specifically, we evaluate the kind of request against the intent and the purpose of the grant. So I think in this case, they were looking to move 1,750 from direct costs and 3,500 from contracted services to supplies and materials. And that was specifically to fund the necessary improvements. So, our grants team thought that approval, that request was in keeping. And that was kind of how it was summarized to me. I think ultimately I approved the authorization to allow that transitions to pay for supplies and materials to complete the project on time.
I don't know if it's useful to offer this as Aaron Aber, the natural resource manager. Nice to meet you. I guess I'll say from the other side, actually, because OSA, the authority often applies for grants. And I think to Jeff's point, sometimes if you don't have a tool and you need a tool, it's kind of a great way to get that done. And it's, a necessary part of the project in some cases, which is not to diminish what you're saying about, gosh, if here we've got a roughly $60,000 invoice. There's $1,000 of tools that are necessary. So you get the kind of concept that clearly if half of it was tools that, may or may not be necessary, that probably wouldn't be, something Matt would approve. So, I guess it's just to say, I think from an agency standpoint, we want to, be able to apply for grants that allow us to get tools because sometimes they're, I see what you mean. There's sort of a degree of tastefulness there.
Well, also, for example, if there was a project that was a one-time project and then it required quite a bit of tools, where would those tools go after? I mean, if this is a project where this would be maintenance, that makes sense. I think if there's a one-time project and full completed, I think in that case, the agents, the authority should really think about taking the tools back. It's where would they go? If it's a one-time project, they're probably going to go to an individual at that point, not the organization. Am I not? Oh, I turned it off. Sorry about that. So I think that's something you can.
Thank you. And then moving on to transaction number 8. So transaction number 8 was also another grant related expense. It was a disbursement to grant 56 to Living Classroom. This was one of the disbursements we provided, we gave to them. So it wasn't the final to close out or anything like that. But as we scroll down, what happened was, I think the expense itself conformed to the plan. I didn't see additional comments, but if you have any questions regarding the project or anything like that.
I did not. I'd love to see these kinds of projects. Next time I'm gonna look closely though to see if there's any tools.
Yeah.
But I didn't, so I don't have any other questions.
I will too, because maybe we need those for our tool inventory.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And why was it a number 3 filter rather than
That's what I'm gonna ask. Sure.
Okay, so then the last one.
Why did you need two different pillars? I don't understand.
Transaction number 9. So transaction number 9 was a new review. And I think we recognize along with the committee that this cover sheet wasn't entirely applicable. Hence a lot of the NAs were checked off. So we were aware of that. But as I was kind of going through, I didn't see any major concerns or questions on whether the expenses conformed with the plan itself, Measure Q or Measure T. But I could try to address some of the questions or comments that appeared at the end of the cover sheet. I think just to kind of address, we do have a process during our work plan development where we kind of build the team. We forecast estimated hours needed by staff to complete the milestones for that fiscal year. And it helps staff, helps plan for staff capacity before approving the work plan. But we don't track this data in Acumatica. What we do track, in Acumatica being our financial system, is the kind of the expenses, not the labor, but the hard cost expenses. And we provide quarterly budget versus actual of that data to the project managers. So accounting provides that. Project managers can also run it, reports themselves. Leadership team also gets quarterly updates. The board and hence the public also gets quarterly updates on the budget versus actual. And it's not just at completion, but they actually get progress because it's at a quarterly basis. It's basically over the lifetime of the project itself. And again, this is the first time we kind of reviewed these labor costs, which by the way, was labor and benefits, just to address one of the comments, which included benefits as in health, vision, dental, plus any employer taxes. And what happens is the way it was presented, it was a printout of a pivot table that was sorted by staff positions. And we were just kind of, perhaps we could have a discussion of how did you find this information helpful? Do you anticipate continuing to review labor costs? If so, we might have to develop, again, the separate cover sheet that makes it more relevant to help with the review. And so any additional items that I might not have addressed, David?
Yeah. Thank you very much. And this is the first time that the EPOC has looked at labor costs, and you picked the good one, Project 28, which is Cody Ridge preparation for the opening up. So I saw your breakout by.
You should try to use the new name, right?
Mine, Oyakma, Cody Ridge. Yeah. So this one was a public access, the planning, and now the construction. It's all the entire. It encompasses both the design and the construction.
Okay. And so I got the you presented, what you call these, the labor items. And then I actually went to the exhibit B to find the actual names and those matched up. I think for the benefit, maybe just the curiosity of the committee and for the record, I'd like to hear maybe a little more detail on how this project is budgeted as far as the labor costs, labor hours, and how it's tracked. Is it just a project manager looking at numbers and saying, we're good? And then what happens when they see a possible probable overrun or an underrun? And then how do they figure in volunteer hours and how that's going to affect project outcomes as far as timing goes or budget? So you know, the tracking the hours, the actual hours is one thing. But are you making progress? You know, based on your budget outlay, and then, you know, the cost at completion, the estimated cost of completion. You know, I don't have, or the public doesn't have an eye towards, you know, what's going on, you know, is there a train wreck coming ahead? I'm sure project managers have an idea, whether that's gonna happen or not. And then, you know, how is that reported? How is it addressed? So, you know, I don't know of anything happening like a major overrun or and again, or even an underrun. And in the case of an underrun and you have a budget set aside, what happens to the difference in costs, the actuals versus the budget? You know, you have this bucket sitting here, $100,000 at the end of the project, 90,000 happens to be 10,000, which is a good problem. But on the other side, you know, you budgeted, let's say, 2,000 hours, and you're realizing, oh my God, this looks like I'm going to go 5,000 hours. So, and then how does that affect, depending on priorities? I don't see project 28 just ending like, oh, you know, money, or maybe it does. So I guess those are a lot of questions, but I'm glad we're looking at hours, because I think that that says a lot, because this is a labor intensive project, not the OSA isn't buying anything, is it giving a grant? It's a real project with a lot of bent over backs and.
Do you have like a specific set of questions you want to ask?
You know, I would,
Is there someone to
Yeah.
address them?
and then maybe, Mr. Freeman or can address that, you know, maybe just a briefing on the budgeting, tracking, and then estimating at completion.
Sure. I'm sorry if I could interrupt, and I'd actually like to direct that question to our fiscal services officer, Justina T.
Sure.
She has a great overview of how the budget actually works and what we do track. And then if, because Matt does oversee from his division this project, he could probably complement that. But I think many of your questions, Justina's got answers on.
So she's the one that would put the hammer down then, is that?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem. So kind of as I mentioned, in terms of respect with labor, we kind of plan and estimate hours, but we don't actually budget in terms, because each project is very distinct. It's not like we can say, oh, opening a preserve, this is X hours, because that's how it might take. But what happens is salaries are budgeted and approved by the board. And we kind of prioritize our work plan and develop an entire work plan based on staff capacity in that sense. Of course, and then we just track hours that are actually incurred. There's no reconciliation in terms of comparing budget versus actuals on labor. We only compare budget versus actuals on expenditures, expenses. And so that kind of covers, hopefully that addresses one of the concern.
So a project manager would be doing all this figuring out. You're not saying, wow, it's gonna cost this much. I'm assuming it's the project manager that's going to figure out the numbers.
In terms of the expenses?
Yes.
Yes. As we kind of put together the work plan and they propose a budget, they are developing what type of work is going to get done in the fiscal year and how much it would cost. And then we're tracking that. And then in terms of obviously over any overruns, we would require board approval for any budget amendments. Underruns, which are the good things. it gets swept back into our carryover, which is also reported to the board every fiscal year at the beginning of the budget, so that they also know how much do we have that was carried over from previous fiscal years before they approve the upcoming work plan, and knowing how much more they can spend or approve to spend. Yes,
When we speak of overages and overages, you refer to materials and other expenditures, not labor.
correct. Correct. And then in terms of reporting out so for this specific project, it's not completed yet, so there's no cost of completion, but in the status report, we are actually reporting to the board, to the committee, to the public, how much we have spent to date for that project. So that is the actuals that you're getting, knowing how much, and again, each fiscal year, the board is approving a budget for that project. So there is a correlation in terms of the total budget that's been approved for that project. And then we are reporting out the actuals. So not quite cost of completion, but every year, fiscal year, we are reporting how much has been spent against that project.
So is there a threshold that you look at that says, when we think that's gonna cost 10% over our budget, we're gonna report to the board?
Technically, if there's not even a 10%, if we need more budget for it, we do require the board's approval for the amendment.
What's in this expenditures? Not labor.
Correct. The labor itself has already been approved by the board as a whole in terms of all staff labor.
What about contractors? We must pay for, that would be an expenditure. at that
Yeah,
point.
yes,
Got that.
yes, yes.
Right.
Okay. I think you've answered the question. Really a question as much as was satisfy my curiosity and for the record.
Mhm.
So appreciate that.
As I kind of covered most of it, it was quite a bit, and I jot down key points as long as I pretty much addressed each kind of point. It was satisfactory. Okay.
So Dave, this is the first time we tried to review cost of employment. Or do you feel like this was a worthwhile exercise? Is there something, as the oversight committee, is there something we're trying to be looking for? And are we able to do it?
I think that looking into labor costs, again, it's relatively clear cut. You have land or buying land. I'm sure the process is complicated, but you can say the land's for sale for $1.7 million. Here's a check for 1.7 million. It's not.
Mhm.
I mean, I don't want to make light of the process,
Yeah.
but when it comes to labor, that there's you budget so much of let's say a senior technician, say, well, I can get 1.7 hours of a lower grade technician at the same cost, so there's that going on. But I think the public or the committee is not really concerned about that as it is about the essentially overrides. And I would like to maybe work with you to maybe create these sample sheets that would work more to address those concerns
Mhm.
if there are. And I'm not implying that there has been any problems. Don't see the OSA in the news.
Only good news.
Only good news. So, going on that, I think that.
David, it seems like the issue of the employment costs, you're okay with, like.
Oh, absolutely.
Maybe,
Yeah.
but the question is, do you think we should do this type of review every year on the employment costs? Do you feel like it was worthwhile? Do you think there's not really something that needs to be done there?
Yeah, as far as, you know, the labor costs per title. I have no issue with that, and that's something that you guys determine, and I'm sure there's factors that come into that. But looking at again, I'm just
I think you have a second completely different issue, which is budget versus actuals, which
yeah, and then that's it.
which is budget of expenditures, not staff cost.
Right.
That's
But in a case like a heavily labor dependent job, like or maybe I would say that's considered the preparation of flying on yacht one. Is there? Wouldn't that be considered a?
Oh, it's hefty and it's high priority.
Yeah.
I guess, actually had a great conversation with Aaron prior to this meeting, but maybe one of the reasons why we typically don't budget for labor is because each project is very unique. And it doesn't lend itself to, like, you know, like, for example, if we say, oh, how much should we budget for opening Minor Yakima? But if we break ground and we find out there's something like a hazmat, I think Aaron had mentioned about hazmat or archaeology kind of incidents or anything like that, it might delay or overrun, you know, staff time looking into it or you know, working on that contingent event that occurs. So then it's more of like, it was more relevant for us to track the staff time versus comparing it to against a budget that doesn't quite, it's not a template that we can apply to a type of project each and every single time. And in a way, the staff costs is already in our budget. I don't want to consider it like a sunk cost, but what happens is that cost is distributed against the prioritized projects and budgeted in that capacity already.
So for example, if you run out of people,
Mhm,
then you drop your lowest priority projects, right?
correct.
Maybe that's what we need to see is the list of priority projects,
Yeah.
projects by priority.
That's a good point, you know, and you know, I'm thinking so as you do that, then I'm sure you have a process that says, okay, you know, debit this, credit this project, and that's in the books.
Again, that is if the expenses of that project gets moved around, not quite necessarily staff time gets moved around. But what happens is, in terms of in the status report itself, we also do report any projects that are on hold or suspended. That also kind of reflects a little bit of delays. Quarterly, we do provide work plan status to the board, which becomes a public document, which then shows the progress of the project. And there might be comments about staff capacity or an incident that might have happened that's delayed, such as a partner can't, you know, or either we submitted CEQA and we're waiting to hear back, and it's causing a delay because it's out of our control, external factors, et cetera.
Okay, so, and there really shouldn't be, and no one is saying, I guess the public trust the OSA to assign the right priorities to the projects, right? You can't, no one is saying, oh, you said you would build that fence next year, and it's not even planned, right? That never happens. Yes. Does it?
Well, our work plan is reviewed and approved by the board. The board kind of provides the guidelines of what our priorities would be, which then the general manager executes and the staff delivers. So in a way, it kind of filters down where the public feeds, you know, the board in terms of, this is what we want. And the board kind of provides that guideline, guidance to us through the work plan and the priorities and what we should be working on. So again, that whole development of the budget and the work plan each year that we undergo, it kind of encompasses that process and what should we be working on? What are we putting where are we putting our investments of our budget into which projects? Where do we put staff on which project?
And at the expenditure oversight commission is not, our responsibility is not to look at the priority. Ours is to just look at, is the expenditures in line with
What Measure Q and Measure P can fund?
UT fund. So it gets me back to the question I was asking you, David, which is, of course, there's the question of, are we spending Measure Q and T money on people who, and the work that people are doing? I guess that's the real question. Are the people who are funded by Measure Q and T working on projects that fall under Measure Q and T? So is there any way to think about that? Or is it just so completely mixed that we can't?
I think the scope of Measure T is pretty broad, and it's thankfully broad. I mean, you'd like to think, we can add another room to the building and a rec room upstairs, and that would probably be out of scope, but that's not an issue. And I think that, if something like that were to come up, if someone went rogue here and started saying, we really need those Maserati four-wheel drives, that starts getting shaky. But so yeah, I have no.
But I have a question though. Is the staffing? Is there a way to identify? Like you might have staffing who works like here that doesn't apply under Measure T.
Yes. So kind of thinking, well, what I do when I review, it would be the entire audit of the agency, which includes other funds beyond Measure Q, Measure T. You would see that our total payroll and benefits, it's separated, it's funded by several different funds.
Right.
Because there are staff, such as me, who might not be working primarily on Measure Q or Measure T projects. So a lot of my staff time is charged to non-Measure Q and Measure T project codes. But what you're seeing is just the Measure Q and Measure T. So it's only the staff that's working on those.
But I think, could we get a list of the staff that is funded, at least in part, by Measure Q and T, and what aspects of their work it applied?
Right. And so if I may, through the chair, actually what you can see in the data that was provided to you is a list of positions that worked on this particular project. And perhaps the question that you might have is, especially after the description that Justina just gave. So I see fiscal services officer listed here. What might Justina have done where we were justified using Measure T or Measure Q funds? And that might be reviewing a contract, assisting with a request for proposal for this particular project. All of that time is billable to this project. And so perhaps we could run through these positions and give you a feel for what somebody in this role might do. Someone like a planner, that might make sense. On the surface, the planning manager makes sense. Clerk of the board. So, Caroline is spending her time maybe at a board meeting or posting a public notice. Pardon me?
The agenda management.
The agenda management. So there are various things that were traditionally folks like Caroline, myself, Justina, we don't perform a lot of duties that are actually fundable by Measure Q or Measure T, but there are a few. And So if you have maybe questions about what these particular people did, as opposed to a whole list and then try to
No,
cover the universe.
no, yeah, by project.
Yeah, maybe if you have some curiosity around this list, we could answer some questions.
I did ask earlier in this meeting. Senior management, why they would be, are they on some level of effort sustaining charge? And the answer was no. Derek actually works on this project and he'll charge against that. So,
Absolutely.
I mean, I see a good level of at least breaking out of the costs. So you do see that. So, and I appreciate that.
Are the salaries here public?
Yes, they are.
Yes.
So, I think what I'd like to request is for next year. To do another one of these, where we do, I see now you have this list. And say. What did each person? What percentage of their salary is it? Given that salaries are public. What percentage of their salary went to this project? And then if we can't get details, it sounds like you have time cards. Or time sheets or something, maybe we could get the list.
A report, we could do an export, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think we're not trying to understand how much people make, it's not that, but it's to get a feel of like, yes, the planning manager spent a lot of his salary on this. But it should, because that was a lot of his time. Whereas if Caroline showed up with a $3,000 charge, we'd be like, come on.
Yeah, how many are
We
to check out?
didn't have information. This is the same
Oh, we didn't, I didn't.
information by, I actually had to go in and look under Project 28. Could we get the
Did
this
we get
exhibit
this?
B information? Sure. I
Exhibit
pulled it out of the-
Oh, is that part of the budget? Wait, no.
yeah, exhibit B.
Where did you get it from?
Oh,
Open the packet.
I believe it's from the previous packet.
Was it in my? Oh.
When we were selecting the transaction.
So could we get this in a CSV file or Excel file?
Mhm.
Because I went through all 154 pages, pulled everything out of Project 20.
28.
And like I said, that was, I think, a really good example of, where you have lots of labor involved and from the variety of folks too. I wouldn't suspect that,
Legal services folks.
I mean, like, I guess Michelle and Terry contributed a little bit. But like Andrew said, if I would have seen, 400 hours there, that would have raised it.
So then, through the chair, kind of a comment on that. Is it more helpful if you actually got number of hours versus dollars? Or is it, because I also analyze hours. That's how we do staff capacity. We don't do it by
Yeah.
dollars.
Hours, that gives you the percentage of time.
Like a full-time, like a 20/80 kind of
Yeah,
sense.
and that way we don't actually have to see their salaries. Need to do it, might be nicer to see X percentage of their time was spent on this project. Was that an appropriate amount of time to spend on the project? And appropriate amount to charge to.
Mhm.
And do we think that's part of our scope? I've been in defense industry where they look at everything. And they will ask, why is a contract manager, working 10 hours a week on this? When, the contract's been let and all they're doing is signing papers at so,
I think it's appropriate, we're not.
I see a lot of good stuff in both.
Yeah,
doing this.
I think that we're not trying to manage, we're just trying to make sure the money is spent appropriately. It's more like, should that person have charged that money to Measure T? And is it the right amount of, does it seem like a lot of money to have charged to Measure T? That's our concern, not, do they get paid too much or they work too many overtime hours? That's not our.
And I'm sure, these two folks right here get these reports and they're gonna see if something's wacko going on. Maybe something wrong with the charge numbers, and this happens. But, that's why you have audits, and I guess that's why you have
That's
overs.
What we're the auditors.
Yeah. And-
Well, I just think I think what we should just think about is for next year. For next year, I think maybe we'll each take, like a transaction that has to do with the hours and we'll look at it that way. And I don't think we should try to figure out a cover sheet this year, because let's wait and see what we do and see what makes sense. And maybe if we think it's something we should do on a regular basis, we'll come up with a different cover sheet. Or,
Okay.
you know, what do we want to call this? Like, not employee charges to labor
Project hours or labor hours.
Yeah. Okay, staff hours charged.
And then we can make just a basic, something really simple of a cover sheet, sorry, just to, I smacked the mic. Just so you've got something to record your thoughts on and something to document.
Yeah.
That would, and then you can, build that out next year as you go through the
This is
exercise.
a first look, and I think that covers good stuff. And a good idea is to, we don't have to check boxes, we can, you know, we might get to a point where we have some standard look. That'll evolve.
Deputy Superintendent, do you have any comments, questions on this?
I'm good, as long as we're sure it's consistent with our, roles and responsibility.
I'm sure we will find out.
To the chair, I was wondering, this is Aaron Neighbor, Natural Resources Manager. I guess I was curious to learn what kind of detail you might be interested in. I mean, you know, I worked quite a bit on this particular project, and happy to talk ad nauseum about my role on it. You know, and you know, I guess I would note that part of the internal review process is through our time card. So for instance, my direct report, David, he manages our integrated pest management program. So if he's taking care of weeds at my own Yakima, he would bill to that through his time card. I would look at it every week, kind of say, okay, yeah, sounds like what David did this week. But they're not necessarily, you know, a level of detail like, you know, barbed oak grass on the North Ascent Trail, right? It's pretty, it's pretty high level stuff. So I guess I just wanted to make sure, you know, sort of the way we track and record information, the granularity is kind of in line with the broad budgetary interests of the EBOC.
I don't think we want you creating any more work for us. That's
Yeah.
for sure. I'm sure that would be.
Well, just, you know, that's one.
And the way we've done it usually is if we get it, we kind of say we want more detail. We usually do it in this setting and just clarify it. We don't typically, I'm sure in the past we have asked for more detail, but there's a lot of it around the Acumatica paperwork and stuff like that, which was all good. All right, we're good with that then?
Yes, that is the 9th and last transaction.
So, so the only recommendations, it sounds like we came out from the transaction review is that next year we will look at transactions in terms of staff resources, apply where the staff funding, staff salary costs are being taken out of Measure T. Is there going to be any Q money left next year?
There will be.
Measure Q or Measure T, and we'll figure out how many transactions we want to do that way next year. We each take one or something like that. There's gonna be 5 of us. Maybe there'll be more.
Does the USA ever accept grants that have stipulations that say this must be used on this particular project with these guidelines, and there'll be no
Those are the only type of grants we have. So actually, the grants that we apply to are specifically, we would have to have the project scoped out, and then we apply for grant funding with that project scope. And it would be used only for that. It can't commingle with any other funds. It's for that purpose. And some, if not all grants, there's reporting that we have to do, provide the final product, the deliverable of what we achieved.
and that would include, you know, financial reports.
Correct. Yes. Documentation, the invoices that we use to pay that we would get reimbursed for the grants.
So no one ever like, here, I would say I've got $1 million. Spend it.
I
That
wish.
never happens? Never?
Not in that, not at that volume. We do get donations from, private members and usually at the end of the calendar year, because everyone's doing taxes, I suppose. But not at that magnitude. Usually it's with other agencies. We do have sometimes private organizations that we would get, but it would always be for a specific project, for a specific purpose.
Are those grants documented on the website?
Not on the website.
But they don't commingle with measures.
And actually, in the status report, whichever project has grant funding, it's actually written in on how it offsets the total project costs. It's, I believe, the top table where it would show the funder. So the funder, either OSA, which is our own money, or it might be another agency that's helping fund that project.
Through the chair, just a little more elaboration on grants. Typically, public agencies like the State Coastal Conservancy or the Wildlife Conservation Board require that our board pass a resolution authorizing us to apply for the grant. And then there are always really detailed stipulations about what the money can go towards. And then almost always those agencies themselves, like in addition to the reports, will audit the agency to ensure that we're still, say, protecting the conservation values, right, of funding that maybe the State Coastal Conservancy used, right? So there are a lot of controls, especially over the public dollars. I think the most generous, least restricted grant we've ever received in my tenure was from a private foundation. And even there too, right, they wanted to ensure that the funding was used, say, to support agricultural conservation activities in Coyote Valley. And, we had X years to spend the money, and then we had to show a report. So, unfortunately, we haven't just gotten wheelbarrows with cash, right? So,
So a couple more things then. I had made a couple recommendations at our last meeting about the website that I'd like to include in our report, but I'd like to find out members if you agree. One was, is there any way to pull up the SCOSA website on the screen so I can show you what I was suggesting? So can you scroll all the way down to the bottom? You remember from last year, I really have this problem that investing in nature just doesn't say what it is. And I would like to recommend that it say investing in nature dash measure Q and measure T. So if someone comes to this website and they're starting their search for measure Q and measure T, they can come down here and find it, because it, like I said before, I don't think investing in nature really implies a parcel tax. So that's one recommendation I'd like to make. And then if you could scroll all the way back up. So I'd like to recommend that, if you click on preserves in that very top banner, it lists the preserves that are open to the public. And then if you go to the next tab over, which is something, and then go down to like land protection, I think it was, click there. This lists all of the land that the authority owns and manages for reasons other than public access. And I would really like to highlight this a little clearer on the website for transparency reasons. Like this, a lot of this work is paid for with Measure Q and Measure T funds. And I personally will mention to friends, like, oh, I'm doing this for the Santa Clara Valley. Oh, how many parks I have? And I go, oh, 4. And they're like, oh, so few. Really? Like all that money and you only have 4 parks? Then, but look at, we have all this other land that we're protecting for other reasons. So what I'd like to recommend is, if you scroll all the way back up, is that instead of having this buried, that there's another tab right next to preserves, says like land protection, and then you would just immediately be able to click there and see, so that again, someone coming to the site would more easily be able to find everything that the authority does. And for transparency and justification of Measure T and Measure Q money that we have more than just for parks. So
I believe that the OSA doesn't self-promote.
I agree.
Yeah, it's, you know, it's. I am speaking praises of the OSA all the time. And, exactly what Andrew says about, you know, it's not just the four spaces. In fact, you know, I've done work places where, oh, OSA manages that. El Toro, you know, that property right there, I think is gonna be cool eventually. And another places that. If you'll say manages. Let the world know,
All right, so
don't hide.
Jeff, any thoughts on that? Maybe that recommendation?
No, I think, I don't know where I saw it, but in one of your publications, there was a numbers page or something like that. That was a lot of things jumped out,
Me too, yeah.
like a total number of acres managed. and stuff
Yeah.
like that. That was
Nice, me too. But I feel like it's varied a little bit, and that's just a little suggestion to bring the.
Sky Riders.
Yeah, well, you know, that doesn't fall under Measure T.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's- I mean, I think we're speaking here more as concerned supporters of USA rather than committee members. But-
No, I'm actually speaking as a committee member, because I
Oh.
think part of our job is to make sure there's transparency of where the money's going. And it could seem like, well, they sure collect an awful lot of money for only 4 parks. So I think there's a need of transparency. We do more than just have parks that are open to the public. We're doing, you know, conservancy and things like that. Okay, so one last thing is we need to just go through the recommendations we made last year. So that we do every year, we give a status on the recommendation. And so these were the recommendations from last year related to the cover sheet. Provide definitions of the 4 categories of transactions and change the title of the last category to other transactions over $1,000, and that's done. Check that the project number matches the purchase order. Check that the invoice amount is not more than the purchase order, so we've done that. Then we had, we remember last year we talked about receipt, confirmation of receipt of payment, but we decided that's not really possible. So instead we have the check. So this is done just in a different way. So we've got that done too. Let's see, provide more detailed guidance in the supporting documentation for tiered projects, which we got. It was very helpful. Include more information from original POs with amended POs. I don't know if that came up in any of the transactions this time, but I'm sure that you did provide it. If it did.
The only one was the Sherwood, when they had to change from Fall Creek to Sherwood. There were some amendments there.
Okay. And then the last one was the pre-approved vendors, which didn't come up this time, but they are in the back of the binder, right? Did anyone have pre-approved vendors that we had to look at this time? No, I don't think so.
No.
But anyway, thank you.
And quite frankly, a lot of the pre-approved vendors aren't typically Measure Q or Measure T vendors.
Right.
In nature, they're more like the utilities, recurring expenses, just to kind of keep the building running.
But it has come up before, that's why we asked.
Yes, that one being the United Site Rentals, because those are the porta potty services, and those are recurring for preserve maintenance and operations that recur on a regular basis.
Okay, so we are done with the transaction review. Is this the public comment point in the meeting? Is that a smile, I guess? Is this a public comment point in the meeting? Karen?
Yes, if there are any members of the public who are online or listening in, now's the time to raise your hand. And if you're calling in, you can press *9. There are none.
Okay. Oh, so someone has to volunteer to write the report. I will volunteer to write the report unless Either of my fellow committee members would prefer to.
I'll assist.
Sounds great. Okay.
You guys just beat me up.
So ready. Okay, so just one thing, I know we have the informational reports, but are we going to, how are we gonna pick the next meeting date and time? I don't know if that will come out as one of the informational reports, or do you wanna do it now or at the end? Oh, no, okay. Should we just wait, or?
I can talk about it a little bit, during the staff portion.
Okay,
We want to.
all right, so, why don't we start with the general manager? Would you like?
Sure, no report for you this evening. Well, actually, I should say, progress continues on Mayano Yakima. I think as it turns out, you're the only group that we've actually been able to take up there to see construction in progress. I thought you would appreciate knowing that. We've scheduled to take our use and management committee, our citizens advisory committee out, a joint group, and they got rained out. They'll be going out in April, I think, to view, but yeah, to date, you're the only committee that's actually been able to see, get a sneak preview. And of course, a little delay with the rains up there, but we're still shooting for May, soft opening, early opening to the public with a ribbon cutting in October. Looking to my colleagues here to confirm, there we go. So you'll be hearing more about that later, but I thought you would appreciate the sneak peek.
What is the soft opening expected?
Yeah, good question. So we're kind of opening up in the middle of wildflower season, which is kind of when people presumptively want to be there most, when we've had early access days in the past, as we call them, kind of special tours. So the soft opening is really kind of referring to this first chunk of time, and then we'll have a grand opening in the fall. And I'll say I gave a lengthy presentation to our board the other night about kind of opening this preserve for the first time, and essentially long and the short of it is have this habitat for the bay checkered spot butterfly. It's an endangered species, basically found nowhere else in the world really except Coyote Ridge. So quite a responsibility to manage that the right way. So we'll basically open it for a year or so, kind of learn, figure out what's working as far as protecting the habitat and people enjoying it, and then kind of enter into a kind of final operations plan based on that sort of data gathering we're doing in that year one. So the first year logistics, for the public is probably what most people care about, is how to hike there. We're setting up a little system called the Butterfly Pass, and then sort of like a 2-minute thing you can fill out on your phone or online, and get your trail pass there. So
Please get some kind of early access. We're putting in all these hours. Because I'm telling you, I tried to sign up for the workday. That was totally booked. It's like the second I saw it. I think there's a lot of interest.
I know the volunteers. I don't know if you're also volunteers, but I know the volunteers are getting out there. I have to give them a similar presentation. So
Yeah.
But yeah, it should be a good wildflower year, and hopefully a good opening for the public. So yeah, you'll see us kind of rolling it out. At first through these kind of fewer events, and then over time it'll be kind of like any one of our preserves with a little bit of that butterfly pass to access the habitat areas.
What kind of metrics do you guys use? Do you actually track population and health of the?
Yeah, it's the numbers committee, isn't it? So we work with there's a scientist, a guy named Stu Weiss, Creekside Science, who's basically life work has been this butterfly, no joke. So we partner with Valley Habitat Agency, and they do annual larval surveys. I think they actually just sort of happened this month, and it's pretty much counting caterpillars. And there's obviously science and data there, but so they kind of track the population. It's a very boom and bust population, kind of naturally. It's very microclimate based. So, every year the weather's a little different, as we all know, and so the butterfly population kind of goes up and down. So that's kind of that part of it. And then, a lot of the data that we're interested in is kind of human behavior on the trails and, are people staying on the trails or off the trails? What are folks seeing out there? So, the data collection is both kind of the biological sciences and then kind of the human behavioral. And then we kind of say, well, gosh, how can we tweak this to make it better and protect the habitat? Yeah.
For a quick report, I'll just share. You've seen a fraction of the expenses so far related to Mayan and Yakima Coyote Ridge, but as you saw the construction, which is underway, future years of the Expenditure Oversight Committee, you'll see much bigger numbers, right? Like to reflect the actual construction costs. And then some other exciting work that's underway related to Measure Q, Measure T right now is our urban grant program. It's one of the real signature, kind of marquee initiatives from those measures. So we've had an amazing response to our grant solicitation for both programs and capital projects.
Once they figured out that you get tools.
There you go. $750,000 available for programs and almost over $1.5 million in applications. So our review committees have their work cut out for them. So anyway, a lot of exciting work. It has passed for that. Yeah. We're reviewing applications and proposals as we speak. Yeah. Good stuff. Yeah, good stuff coming.
Anything else from staff?
I have a question for you, and this is unrelated, but is the OSA participating in the county safety element update?
Oh, I'm not sure. I saw Aaron go for his mic, so perhaps he has an answer.
Yeah, at my old job, I used to work in Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District. I know we got there's some emails about this recently. I think the short answer is it probably makes sense for us to participate. I mean, there's some legal things and some insurance things related to emergency. So I haven't actually briefed my colleagues on it, but I think we're hoping to participate. It makes sense, especially in certain rural service areas. So, like speaking for Mid-Penn, my old job, they're a very large landowner in very large portions of the county. So, there's a sort of community expectation around emergency response, regardless of what that agency's like mission is or isn't, right? If you live there, you think, gosh, they own so much land. You don't know who Caltrans is, who Cal Fire is, who County Roads is, right? It's just a hodgepodge of government bureaucracy. So, Mid-Penn participated, and I think it makes sense for OSA to participate on a level that reflects our interests.
Yeah, I was looking at that in the notices, from the perspective of obviously there's the professional responders, fire, police. But that the community emergency response team is also another asset that shouldn't be overlooked, because you're looking at a whole community of people who just want to volunteer, who want to serve. And I was thinking, how would that apply to the OSA? I think, for example, during the fires, we could have had these volunteer patrols, just walking around, checking for the spot fires that really threaten Sierra Vista. And they could have been spotting them and even responding to them. They're trained to put out small fires. So, and that could have been something that they could have cooperated with, but they have to be integrated into a response plan. So anyway, thanks for bringing that up.
Okay, through the chair. So in regards to scheduling the next meeting, so the third meeting is typically when the committee goes through the report line by line. So in taking into consideration how long you might want to take to write the report, then we can look for dates around, a comfortable period of time.
I would say, I would probably Not that the report will take that long, but I've got a lot going on right now, so I'd say 3 weeks.
Okay, so we'll start looking in 3 weeks and then I can send you dates, Tuesday or Wednesday, and then we can do the same thing, middle of the day versus evening. I can give you a couple of options. Let me know what works best for you.
That's great.
Okay.
Any other staff report? Yes, any committee members have anything they'd like to report or comment on? Or questions?
We still have room for 2 more committee members, so once in a while, post your friends, social media buddies.
But out of curiosity, do we know how Rahma and Linda found out about the position?
Yes.
Okay.
So Linda in particular, Linda Marquez originally applied to be on the CAC.
Oh, yeah.
And she lives in District 4. So after having a conversation with the District 4 board member, Garnetta Amapol, Garnetta went with a different applicant for CAC. However, she recommended Linda apply for LEPOC, given her background. So that ended up working out that way. And I believe Rahma, and Linda's also on trail patrol.
Yeah, that's right.
And then Rahma, I want to say, it's off a flyer somewhere. I'm not sure.
Let's go when she comes back. Although,
But the flyers on the preserves have actually, if it's not word of mouth, it's actual hikers coming across our flyers at our preserves. So that's worked out well for us.
the only comment I'd like to make is I just think we should just stop using Coyote Ridge because a lot of people, it's already on their tongue and they just won't make the move until we force them to. So Mayan Oaxaca should be it. Mayan
And people confuse it with Coyote Valley.
right. I think this will really.
Oh, I was there.
And Coyote Hill, it's now Coyote Hills, Major Park, so, yeah, that's how you leave off.
Nope.
Okay, I believe we can adjourn. All right. We're done. Thank you.